Homer's The Odyssey, retold by Geraldine McCaughrean. Chapter 1. Yearning for Home. The war lasted so very, very long. Then suddenly it was over in a flash of fire, a splash of blood and a trampling of horses. Men whose ships had rolled idly over 1,000 tides in the Bay of Troy mustered by the water's edges in groups. There were many faces missing, many oars lacked a rower after 10 years of war. But those who unfurled their sails, latched their oars over the oar-pins, and set the tillers were cheerful. Their masts were hung with tokens of victory, and their holds were full of Trojan gold and wine. Best of all, they were going home. Home! To wives they had not seen for 10 years, to sons who had grown from boys into young men, to daughters who had grown from babies into beauties, to farms that had lain tangled and untended under 10 hot summers. A few strokes of the oar and they would be home. All those men who had answered the call to war and mustered from every island and shore around the ocean. The long, fast ships were heaved off the sand and gravel and into the deep water. Friends stood waist deep in the sea, waving and waving and waving. Till we meet again, Nestor. Until we meet again, Menelaus. Until we meet again, all you brave Myrmidons. Safe journey, Odysseus. Odysseus felt the sand and gravel grate against the bottom of his ship. Then, with a rush of white water past the bow and crack of his sail as it filled, he leaned on the tiller and turned his eyes away from the shoreline and the still smoking ruins of Troy. He was going home to his three-island kingdom of Ithaca. His cockerel mascot crouched triumphantly on a stern rail. Mustered behind his own fast black ship like cygnets behind their swan were 11 others, all manned by men of Ithaca, Cephalonia, and wooded Xanthi. At first, their rowing was ragged. Their oars beat out of time for lack of practice, and their shoulders burned under the Trojan sun. But gradually they settled into a rhythm, a splash, a grunt, and a sigh. "Your son will be a big lad now, Captain," said Polites. 11, almost 11. He was only a baby when I left Ithaca. A fine help I've been to his mother, leaving her all alone. Ah, but such a lady, Captain, such a lady as never knew the meaning of impatience. Odysseus looked into the distance with unfocused eyes. Indeed, yes, Polites, such a woman. High in the window of Pelicate Palace, Penelope, queen of Ithaca and wife of Odysseus, looked out across a wave-striped ocean. A dark shape caught her eye, far, far out across the sea. At once she was leaning out of the window, and her hands were plunged into the unpruned vine which cloaked the palace walls. "Odysseus! Odysseus!" Her voice rang through the empty courtyards and tumbled over the cliff edge. Her son, Telemachus, stopped his game of archery and ran towards the house. But it was only the shadow of a scudding cloud, and not a ship at all. Penelope pressed her cheek against the cold stone of the window frame and steadied her breathing. Behind her, Telemachus tumbled into the room. "Is it him, Mamma? Has father come home from the war?" Penelope turned away from the window, smiling. "Not yet, Telemachus. I was mistaken. Not just yet." A breeze sprang up. The breezes braided themselves into a wind, the wind twisted itself into a gusting gale, and the gale screwed itself into a frenzy. Odysseus' 12 ships were juggled by the waves. Those on the crests and those in the troughs clashed sides as they rose and fell. The crews looked in terror at their comrades and saw them one moment against a sky crazed with lightning, the next in a valley of glazed black water that enveloped in clouds of spray. They raised their oars, but they were too slow to lower the sails, which ripped in 3. Their cloaks were so wrenched at by the winds and the cords had half throttled them. 200 voices called on the gods, and prayers skimmed like seagulls over the teeming sea. For 9 days and nights they ate stopping bread and drank rainwater, cupping it out of the bilges with their hands. "Land! Where? I don't believe you." "There! There! It's a cloud! It's a reef! It's an island! We shall be driven past, we shall be driven on, we shall be broken up. We shall be saved," said Odysseus loudly and calmly, "and the gods are to be thanked for it." The gods were indeed to be thanked. The storm died in an instant, and they found themselves on a sunlit beach of white sand. Strewn like flotsam, the 12 ships lay on their sides, and the sea tickled their round bellies. The crews crawled up on the sand, and most fell asleep on their hands and knees. "Can we go and look for food?" said Eurylochus. "You don't want to rest?" said Odysseus in amazement. "I've got a wife and 6 daughters to get home to, and I don't mean to keep them waiting any longer than need be, Captain. I've been away 10 years already." Very well, but go carefully. Take just 20 men with you. I don't want the islanders to think that we are an invasion force, and don't get into any fights. Odysseus himself was anxious to inspect the boats for any damage. So Eurylochus took men and went inland in search of food and fresh water. The sinking sun wounded the sky, the night bruised it black, and still Eurylochus did not come back. Odysseus waited until first light to begin the search. Leaving the ships well guarded, he took 50 men inland through the dense, luxurious trees. Velvety, succulent leaves stroked their faces. Sweet-smelling flowers drooped, heavy laden with nectar, and sprinkled their hair with pollen. There was a noise of water bubbling underground, and dark-eyed fawns peeped at them from between golden grasses. What danger could there be in a place like this? Whispered Polites at Odysseus' shoulder. The king of Ithaca said nothing, but the hairs on the nape of his neck were lifting. No more than a mile along the green and shady path, they were dazzled by a clearing bright with sunlit water. Round the lake stood a village. In the shade of the palm leaf roofs, their sword belts all unbuckled, lay Eurylochus and his 20 men, as well as a pride of naked locals. The young native men and women all had long, thick hair which spilled over their shoulders and over the guests lying in the grass. They were plying their visitors with fruit from wooden bowls, and at the sight of Odysseus, leapt up smiling and ran and took hold of the newcomers and dragged them towards the shade. Their hands were as brown as chestnuts and their skin as sticky as chestnut buds with juice for the fruit. Their words were soft murmurs, hums like half-remembered tunes, and their mouths never once stopped smiling. Eurylochus smiled too. He smiled at Odysseus as at someone whose face was dimly familiar, and his words slurred a little when he said, "Don't I know you? Come and have some of this fruit. There's plenty. Plenty! Taste it! You never taste alike. Know you, don't I? Do I?" He tossed a piece of fruit, a golden globe wrapped in velvety skin, and Polites reached up to catch it. But Odysseus snatched the fruit out of the air and cast it into the pool. He whispered over his shoulder, "Tell the men, no one is to touch the fruit." He waved away the sticky brown hands that offered him luscious food. Then he called out to Eurylochus, "What of your wife and 6 daughters, my friend? Will you keep them waiting while you idle here?" "Who? What? Sorry, friend, but I think you've got the wrong man. Wife, daughters? Have some fruit. That's what you need. Some fruit to set your brain straight." And as Eurylochus spoke, the juice ran down his beard and stained his chest a sugary crystalline gold. Polites was alarmed. "What's the matter with him, Captain? What's the matter with all of them?" The native girl pressed a fruit against Odysseus' lips until he took a grip of her wrist and pushed it away. "Have you never heard of the lotus eaters, Polites?" "The lotus eaters? Lotus eaters? Eaters?" The name echoed through the ranks of Odysseus' 50 men, and their faces turned deathly white. Odysseus leapt up onto the poolside log. "Courage, men! Your comrades have been eating the lotus fruit. Their memories have melted and their wits have drowned in the treacherous juice. They care nothing now for us or for the families waiting for them. Are we to abandon them here, or shall we save them from ourselves? Close up your ears and seal up your lips and help me carry them back to the ships." Round the pool they ran, pushing aside the fawning caresses of the villagers and overturning the bowls and baskets of lotus fruit. They seized on their friends, 2 men to 1, and dragged them to their feet. "Leave us be! What are you doing? Get away! Who are you?" shrieked the lotus-eating Greeks. "You barbarians! Look, if it's the fruit you want, there's plenty for everyone. What are you doing? Where are you taking us? Leave us be! For pity's sake, don't take us away from the fruit." The further they were dragged away from the pool and down the shady path, the more desperately the advanced party struggled and pleaded and shrieked. "The fruit! We must take the fruit! What are you doing? We can't leave without the fruit! We die! We'd all die without it! It's life! It's everything! Pity us! Don't make us leave the fruit!" Shutting their eyes, shutting their ears, and sealing their lips, Odysseus and his party of 50 men dragged their foolish friends down towards the sea, though their sandals kicked at the ground and their hands clutched at tree branches in terror. The lotus-eating villagers pattered along behind, making a murmured music with their whimpering. But as they got further from the grove where their beloved lotus tree grew, they dropped away and ran back toward the village. "Take some fruit, please! A morsel of fruit if you have a shed of pity in you," begged Eurylochus. "Should we, Captain?" asked Polites anxiously. "We must have food if we're to row." But Odysseus forbade 1 lotus root to be taken aboard, and the 12 ships were heaved into the surf as empty as they had come. What use would it be to row if we had forgotten where we were going, he said. Tie the lotus eaters to their benches and don't untie them until this place is out of sight or they'll try to swim back. And so they would, but for the strong hemp that bound them and the determination of their friends who heaved on in shining oars. At last their brains struggled free of the cloying nectar of the deadly fruit. They began to remember and to be ashamed. And tight bound to their benches in the rolling bilges of the fast black ships, they began to feel very seasick indeed after eating all that fruit. Chapter 2. The Sea God's One-Eyed Son. One thing there was in plenty: wine. Wine looted from Trojan cellars, slopped in pointed earthenware amphoras, rammed deep into heaps of sand in the stern of each ship. But as for food, there was not a bite left. Odysseus allowed his men to drink a sip of the Trojan wine in the hope that it would raise their spirits. But to his horror, they immediately rolled into helpless drunkenness before slumping asleep on each other's shoulders. A little too strong, he said to his cockerel. A little too strong, he said to his cockerel mascot, and the cockerel shrugged its wings and fluffed out its feathers. The boats drifted for want of rowing. Land! Shouted the lookout next day. Look, vines, olive trees, goats. Let's go and load the boats right now. Let's just tread warily and take what we are given, said Odysseus. I shall take one ship's crew and make contact with the people living there. The rest of you moor by that little island offshore and wait there till I send word that it's safe to join us. So one sole ship sailed up to the rocky mainland, past cliffs pitted with caves and planted with olive trees and corn. It is hard to judge size looking inshore from a boat, or they might have wondered at the size of the cavernous cave dwellings or the height of the whiskered corn. Not a boat was moored in the bay, for the art of shipbuilding had not yet reached this remote outreach of the world. There was nobody about. Bring that amphora of wine, said Odysseus. We may be able to trade it for food or give it as a gift if we are received graciously. It took 4 strong men to carry the huge stone jar, slung between 2 oars by its looping lug handles. They scrambled ashore and up a path to the nearest of the caves. The smell of cheese and sheep was overpowering as they entered. The wine-bearer set down the wine and propped the oars against the shadowy rear wall. As they did so, they fell over a huge, soft millstone of cheese. Look at the size of this, Captain. Come on, let's take at it. Look at the size of this, Captain. Come on, let's take at it and get out of here. It's food enough to last us as far as Ithaca. What? Steal? When we could wait and be given it? Said Odysseus a little pompously. The laws of hospitality demand that our host gives us food for our journey. The sinking sun shone in through the cave mouth, and as the night insects began to chirrup, the cliff dwellers came back from the pasturing their sheep and the cattle inland. The crewmen could hear pebbles dislodged from the pathways tumble into the sea. Then the sheep arrived. Sheep? They were the size of buffalo, fleecy as the bales of flax shipped in 1s and 2s on the great ships of Crete. The sheep were delicate alongside their shepherd, a monstrous landmass of flesh and bone whose knuckles trailed in the dirt and whose mouth was a cave itself. In the center of his forehead, rimmed with rheumy lashes, gaped a single massive eye. The Cyclops drove his sheep into the cave, rolled a boulder across the entrance to seal it, and then revived the fire smoldering in the center of the cave. As it flared up, it lit the oval staring faces of the astounded Greeks. The single light gleamed as it fixed on each man in turn, and the Cyclops grinned. Hello, peoplings. Aren't you little? Indeed, indeed. Poor miserable specimens come to admire their famous race of one-eyed giants, said Odysseus, who was not just a hero and a king, but a diplomat. The Cyclops had difficulty in hearing the small piping voice. He cleaned one ear with his finger. 2 eyes. Almost repulsive. But I won't let it put me off. Me, Polyphemus. I'll try anything once. Reaching out, he picked up the fattest member of the crew and crammed him into the cavernous mouth. It happened so fast. There was no scream, no shout of protest. When the second man was taken, the Greeks set up a clamor which shook the cliff, racing from side to side of the cave and beating with their fists on the rock. Sir, cried Odysseus, struggling to keep the terror out of his voice, where did you learn your manners? From the scum of Troy? Everyone knows that the gods frown on the man who shows unkindness to his guests. Nobody frowns on Polyphemus, said the Cyclops, tapping his hairy chest. My father's a god. I can do what I like. He began counting them with an outstretched finger and licking his hairy lips. Are there any more of you outside? Where did you come from? Did you come out of a hole in the ground like ants, or did you fly down from the sky? Made brave by fury, one man began to say, We came off the sea in warships with swords and spears aboard, and yes, there are plenty of good men who would be here now if they had not been wrecked and drowned on the rocks, said Odysseus, quickly, to protect the 500 waiting in ignorance on the little island offshore. Better 50 should be lost than 550. And who are you, skinny one? Said the Cyclops, walking his fingertips across the floor towards Odysseus. For a moment he was tempted to throw back his head and declare, I am Odysseus, king of Ithaca, hero of Troy, whose deeds are spoken of by poets and whose kingdom encompasses Cephalonia and wooded Xanthi. But Odysseus said instead, My family name is Atal, but I was the sorrow of my mother and my father's shame. So small am I of stature that my parents called me nobody. What pride could you take in such a prisoner? Now roll back the boulder and let us go, or I won't give you the present I brought with me to your cave. Present? What present? I like presents. Want a present? Give me a present. Give me, and I won't eat you, nobody. Promise, 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 said the Cyclops, thumping his fists on the floor. Very well, since you ask so graciously. Men, fetch out the amphora. Greeks crawled out from every corner of the cave, sobbing with fright. They had no wish to give the Cyclops so much as a smell of their sweat, but they trusted their captain, and they heaved the stone wine jar out of the shadows. Boo, is that all? I've got wine of my own, snarled Polyphemus. Not like this, you haven't. So Polyphemus broke off the neck of the amphora and took a swig. Fair. The flavor settles to the bottom, said Odysseus keenly. The first taste is good, but the last dregs are best. So Polyphemus drank it all, and he had to agree that the more he drank, the happier he grew until, when the amphora was empty, he was so happy that his brains were like melted butter and his words as scrambled as eggs. Good present, nobody. Like it, Polyphemus. Sleep now. All show sleep now. Morning time, eat you, nobody. Eat you? Inquired Odysseus, hoping he had misunderstood. No, Shilly, can't eat me, eat you. But you promised, cried Odysseus indignantly. I lied, said Polyphemus, with a beaming smile before falling backwards unconscious. For a moment there was silence, then a general rush for the doorway and a great heaving against the boulder. It was futile. The men fell exhausted to their knees and wept openly. We're done for, Captain. It didn't work. Your plan didn't work. My plan has only just begun, said Odysseus, from the rear of the cave where he had stood to watch them struggle with the boulder. Who has a knife with him? Help me work this sword to a point, quickly. The drink won't keep our hospitable friend asleep for too many hours. With knives and flints off the floor of the cave, they whittled at the rounded end of one of the oars by which they had carried the wine jar. When it was worked to a point, they laid it in the dying embers of the fire. And when it was glowing hot and ready to burst into flames, they tempered it, hard as metal, by splashing it with milk from the ewe sheep. Again they laid it in the fire. By the time it was glowing white hot, the darkest, latest hour of the night had begun, and the monstrous Cyclops was beginning to stir. Men who had charged the brass gates of Troy once more stood side by side, the sharpened oar resting on their shoulders like a battering ram. Odysseus nearing the glowing point. He gave the word to run forward. He aimed the oar. He guided the point into the He gave the word to run forward. He aimed the oar. He guided the point into the opening eye of the waking Cyclops. But he and all his men fell back from the noise which followed. Polyphemus arched his back and clawed at them and at the pain in his head. He took hold of the quivering oar and wrenched it out of his tormented face and hurled it. The sheep scattered in terror. The Greeks threw themselves on their faces and prayed to the gods. The Cyclops' screams clamored in the cave like the clapper in a bell, rattled the cave in its cliff face. Landslides crumbled into the sea below. Other Cyclopses were brought from their beds, men and women, all as vast as trees, crashing about in the outer darkness, hurrying to the aid of their neighbor. What is it, Polyphemus? Who's in there with you? The cry came back. Nobody. Nobody at all has hurt me. Nobody at all is in here. Oh, someone tell my father nobody at all has blinded me. The Cyclopses peered at each other in the moonlessness. Well, that's all right then. A nightmare, obviously. We're glad to hear it, Polyphemus. Peace be on your eyelid till morning." And away they went, a little bad-tempered at having been roused up for no purpose. When Polyphemus heard them go, he lapsed into a terrible silence, staring about him at the unutterable darkness of his everlasting night. At last he said, "Your plan has failed, nobody. I am not dead, but you and your comrades will never leave this cave alive." Outside, the night sky turned pale with fear. It was morning. But no sunlight creeping in round the massive boulder told Polyphemus that it was daytime. Only the bleating of his sheep. "Oh, my woolly ones! You want to be out in the daylight. Of course you do. Don't I know, better than any of you, how to long for the sunlight? It's gone. I'll never see it again. I'll never see anything again. Blind. Oh, you gods, to be blind forever. The sea's blue is nothing but a noise. The grass is green is nothing but a wetness underfoot. Oh, my dear, happy, ignorant little sheep. If only you could speak and tell me where those Greeks are hiding. I'd pull them like wishbones. I'd have them die 20 times over in the killing of them." Feeling the contours of the familiar boulder which stopped up his cave, he put his shoulder to it and rolled it aside. But he sat himself in the very center of the doorway, with his hands spread to either side so that no loathsome Greek should pass him alive. The sun warmed his back, and his sheep pushed forward, bleeding. "Slowly now, quietly, my little loves," said the Cyclops tenderly. "It would never do for the villains to get by me by clinging to your fleece." And he felt along their backs and along their fleecy sides before he let them pass. Little did he realize that Odysseus had roped each ewe together in threes, and that underneath each center sheep a man clung for his life. Soon all the sheep but one had passed Polyphemus. Only the big old ram remained, with Odysseus himself clinging beneath its belly. As it passed the Cyclops, he took hold of its head with his two great hands and wept from his lost eye. "Oh, my old mate, my dear old friend and companion! Would to the gods you speak and describe the beauty and the wilderness of the world. What use am I to you now? Can I milk your ewes or guide you to the pasture lands? I shall have to give you to my worthless neighbors, the scum who left me in agony last night and never came to my aid. Oh, woolly one, I'm sorry. You'll never know how sorry I am." At last, he let them pass. At last, he let the ram pass by, and Odysseus dropped onto his back on the rough cliff path. He took to his heels and ran after his men gathered by now on the beach below. They were wrestling the sheep into their fast black ship, food for the voyage. They pushed off. They bent across their oars. The sea rose while beneath the prow. Their course lay past the cliff pitted with caves, right below the cave mouth where Polyphemus sat feeling about for his enemies. The memory of his two dead companions galled Odysseus. He could not unfix his eyes from the huge, hairy back of the weeping Cyclops. All at once he got to his feet and roared, "I am Odysseus, Polyphemus! I am Odysseus, hero of Troy, and my kingdom encompasses Ithaca, Cephalonia, and wooded Xanthi. It was I who blinded you, and the poets will one day praise me for it in songs of 60 verses." The men at their oars stared at him in disbelief. Even his mascot, his own cockerel, pecked him in the arm. But Odysseus was unrepentant. "What harm can it do?" he blared. "There's no one but a blind Cyclops to hear me." Polyphemus heard the taunt and rose to his knees, then to his feet. He cocked his ears towards the sound of Odysseus' voice. He picked up the boulder from the opening of his cave and raised it over his head. Before he let it go, he raised his blinded face to the heat of the sun and bawled, "Father! You god of the oceans, Poseidon, god of the sea, hear my curse. See what Odysseus, king of Ithaca, has done to your son. Hate him with all the heat of the earth's core as I do. Hate him with all the unforgiveness of earth's icy peaks as I do. Curse him as I curse him. Avenge me, for I am powerless to be avenged." And he hurled the boulder. It hit the water a fraction behind the stern post, and the wave it raised lifted the boat like a hand and thrust it forward, gouging a furrow through the sea. Headlong they hit the little offshore island. Keel long the boat split, spilling the rowers onto the silver shingle. Odysseus, as he rolled clear, laughed out loud and kicked his feet in the air. "So much for the curses of a Cyclops," he snorted as his crew of 500 and more gathered round him, slaughtering the captured sheep. But of those who had escaped from the cave, not one laughed and not one congratulated him. 2 of their comrades were dead, eaten by the Cyclops, and Polyphemus had cursed them. Odysseus scowled and lay on his back, looking up at the sunny morning sky. "Poseidon, did he say?" whispered a voice over his heart. "Are we to be cursed by Poseidon, the god of the sea?" And somewhere in the ocean's well, the cries of Polyphemus set the electric rays trembling and the jaws of clams agape. "Polyphemus is blinded," they cried. "A curse on Odysseus and all of his men."